What I wrote about with regard to Dietrich Bonhoeffer was some of what caused a change in his life at a very early age. He was one of the first, some would say the only, German theologian to speak out publicly against the Nazis. And he did that in 1933. He was 27, 28 years old. The professors that had taught him at the University of Berlin, many of them were supportive of the Nazis, and this young whippersnapper was adamantly opposed to them. In fact, it ended up leading him to the gallows, Flossenburg concentration camp, where he was killed by the Nazis for his resistance to them. Number of scholars, predominantly white, who have been writing about Dietrich Bonhoeffer have not talked about race, even though he was actively resisting the Nazis during World War II without conversation about race. Well, he spent a year studying in Harlem, 1930-31, postdoctoral student at Union Seminary. Spent most, if not all, of his free time in Harlem. He became a lay leader at Abyssinian Baptist Church. And he was reading quite a bit about the Renaissance. When I was in Germany this summer, I went to the public library where his holdings are at, what we have left of his library, and what he brought back from New York. And scholars had wondered, what was he reading during the Harlem Renaissance? What was he reading? Because he mentions reading all of these different, he's collecting all of this stuff. They had no idea what he was reading. Well, he's got a bibliography that he brought back with him from Harlem. There's no mention of that. I'm looking through the bibliography and looking at the sources that I cite in my book, that I deduced he must have had contact with based on the time that he was there and when these things were published. Well, they're right there in his bibliography that he brought back with him to Berlin. Just been sitting there since his death, actually, since those things were brought to Berlin. But I'm paying attention to them. So the book is a detailed account of the impact of that time in Harlem on his resistance. And I've been pleased by its reception and the award that it's won for the first treatment of this material. So there's that. What I want to talk with you about today is my current research that takes from Harlem. What I did in the initial book was a look at what the Harlem Renaissance and black church how that must have appeared to this young German white guy. Now it will stand on its own. There are really 3 Harlem Renaissances happening in the Harlem Renaissance, which is a period of time in New York specifically. Actually, it's a moment for the black West, for kind of the African diaspora in general, that happens around the turn of the century, 20th century. There are really 3 happening there. I'm talking specifically about one. The first one would be what scholars describe as racial uplift. And there are different kinds of racial uplift. One racial uplift that's trying to identify itself with what is generally understood as American and white in culture, some would argue, by the notion of the talented tenth and family values and so forth. That's one. The other one is what some would argue as a queer Renaissance, troubling the notion of white patriarchy, normativity. A man named Shane Vogel has written a book about the cabaret, and this is there. Skip Gates says that the Harlem Renaissance is as gay as it was black. This is all there. Those Harlem Renaissances are historical. The primitive and the exotic with the cabarets and the night scene and the dance and the jazz and so forth. There's also a Harlem Renaissance that is troubling what we understand about whiteness and its connection to divinity. Kind of a divine attributes of whiteness. This is happening in numerous ways, and it is that I am paying attention to. It's that slice that I am focusing on in particular, and how it troubles what we understand about what it means to be human. And you'll hear that as I talk through, as we go through the lecture here. So, if you'll bear with me. The house lights dim in the audience, and the stage lights brighten, drawing the audience's attention towards an empty stage. A male voice booms through a speaker, announcing a question that he clearly intends to be discussed. What is a Negro? This is how the Harlem Renaissance playwright Hughes Allison begins his play titled It's Midnight Over Newark. The play was written to be a communal experience, what Professor Craig Prentice described as a living newspaper, reporting information that was meant to educate, to inspire, and to change an interactive audience. The provocative question, what is a Negro, was not rhetorical, it was instructive. In the course of the play, it quickly becomes apparent that an answer to that question is multi-layered, and that there are indeed popular social answers, but they exist primarily as adjectives. Negroes are black, primitive, exotic, loud, capricious, meaning unreliable or unpredictable, unintelligent, violent, passive, meaning they give in to demands, social demands or oppression, lazy, religious. Indeed, above all, Negroes are understood to be a religious people. These descriptors do not exist, the list of adjectives alive in the collective mind of society for black people then or now. But they do highlight at least two important things that we should notice. First, they tell those paying attention that in society, people generally believe that they can know something definitively about a whole group of people without having real interaction with them. That idea exists in the collective social mind because of common familiarity with the category of race and what race tells everyone about all of humanity. Second, it's often the case that what passes for truth about racial groups is commonly inconsistent and unreliable. For instance, violent and passive, capricious and unintelligent, lazy and religious are words with dissonant definitions, many would argue, held together in the historical bricolage that is the definition of Negro. Bricolage, that term, bricolage, is a micmash of things smashed together. A bricolage, that is the definition of Negro, as the play indicates. But where did the adjectives come from? Is it appropriate to ask if they're right? Not only should we ask how society has come to define black people in this way, I'm proposing that we ask another question, which is this. Given the historical preponderance of negative stereotypes about black people, what role does religion play in that description? In this lecture, I want to address those questions as highlighting distortions within our theological anthropology and as a problem for Christian ethics. That is, our fundamental understanding of human beings as made in God's image and biologically arranged by race poses a problem for our Christian moral lives. What we believe we know about what it means to be human in the West is foundational for guiding our understanding of and interaction with everything related to heaven and earth, shaping our social interacting, our theology, our worship, and our hopes for the kingdom of God. We cannot be faithful Christians without attention to the problem inside of the question in Allison's play, what is a Negro? I would double down on that. We cannot be faithful Christians without it, without paying attention. Allison's question leads us into the problem of a fundamental belief in the organization and classification of all human beings by a variegated, categorized arrangement of races within a Western world understanding of Homo sapiens. This way of understanding human beings shares a history with the European trope of the ideal human, ideal humanity, visualized by Leonardo da Vinci's 15th century depiction of Vitruvian man. Leonardo da Vinci borrows this from an earlier depiction of a Greek man or male. Here you have the perfect proportions, the perfect proportions of the ideal human being, rendered male. And while its parents belong to an earlier era, race is as recent as the American colonies and as old as the practice of chattel slavery. The science of race was birthed in a financial effort to legitimize the theft of bodies and labor from Africa. First came the transatlantic slave trade, as early as the 15th century. Then came the scientific language to support it in the 18th and 19th century, during the Enlightenment. Enlightenment scientists like the Swedish botanist Carl von Linnaeus were architects of race science. Scientists, philosophers, and politicians like Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, Voltaire, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and Thomas Jefferson helped to formally craft race as a naturally occurring biological process of organizing human beings. In his remarkable work of science, Systema Naturae, Natural Systems, Carl Linnaeus introduced the world to the term Homo sapiens and to the Linnaean Taxonomy, which is a rank-based scientific classification of living organisms. His taxonomy described 5 types of Homo sapiens, categorized according to skin color and land of origin: the Americanus, the Asiaticus, the Africanus, the Europeanus, you gotta be careful when you say that one, and the Monstrossus. Each race had visible biological markers with corresponding innate character traits. Americanus were copper-colored or red-skinned, obstinate, without content, stubborn of character, angered easily. His clothing was paint, and he was governed by customs. Asiaticus was sooty, melancholy, and rigid. Some accounts of the taxonomy say yellow-skinned, easily distracted, haughty, and covetous, covered with loose garments and governed by opinions. Yes. Europeanus, you hear it every time I say it now, were fair-skinned people, sanguine and brawny, blue-eyed, gentle of character, inventive minds, covered with close vestments, and governed by laws. Well, well. Africanus was black-skinned with a relaxed, phlegmatic disposition, black frizzled hair, silky skin and a flat nose, crafty, indolent, meaning lazy, and negligent. Like the red-skinned types, Africanus was not described as wearing clothing. They anoint themselves with grease and are governed by caprice, that is, unreliability or unpredictability. Interesting thing about many of these scientists is that they made a connection between geography, morality, and intellect. Some of these earlier scientists argued that the geography, with its difficulty in producing agriculture, or its heat, had a direct effect upon the physical appearance of the body, on the morality. Maybe it's difficult to farm, crop, and so forth. And so they do other things to get what they need, apart from being able, which prohibit them from being able to order and structure society safely. And to produce the kind of culture that you would have within the 40-50 window. Now, this doesn't have a, does it have a little laser on it? It does. Where's the laser at? How do I do that? Is that the visual? Oh, there it is. I think that's it. There it is. So, 40-50 window. What do you know? It just happens to correspond with Europe. How amazing. The 40-50 window, longitude, latitude, creates the most beautiful, intelligent, and moral people. If you take someone from, this is what they thought earlier, you take beings from these more difficult areas closer to the equator, where the geography distorts humanity, and bring them into this 40-50 window here, they will turn white. This is how it was thought. Maybe they didn't use the language of white. They were talking about beautiful and moral and cultured. So Europe is not only a location, a geographical location, it is a people-making process. Finally, the category of the monstrosities was a catch-all pale for the types that he could not pin down by classification. It was a waste bin category. Some of these creatures here, they actually believed existed. What's interesting is that in the mind of this first scientist of the taxonomy, these creatures were as real as these. Fascinating. Linnaeus was not the only one to classify and rank human types, but many credit him with creating the first taxonomy. Like Blumenbach and others who came along after him, the practice of categorizing and ranking human beings was academic peddling in European aristocratic tropes of the ideal human being. A self-aggrandizing fetish of cultural longing that saw Europe and Europeans as the world's center and the ideal community populated with ideal human beings. The racial ideal of Europeanus was built upon the notion of ideal humanity and perfected by the financial incentive offered by slave labor. That is to say, it was a financially incentivized anthropology. Financially incentivized by slave labor. Da Vinci's 15th century visualization of the perfect human body was the artistic forerunner of the scientific creation of the 18th century white man. You follow that? This is the forerunner of the scientific creation of whiteness, white masculinity. For our purposes today, the blend of science and art, which is present in this depiction, the blend of science and art was also put into the service of religion, making it a composite of art, science, and theology. One could also argue that religion was put into the service of politics, made use of science and art for that purpose, becoming a three-part device of what I would call a biopolitical social organizing scheme. Dominant European and American depictions of Jesus became a theological reflex of the notion of ideal humanity, providing scientific and theological justification for white supremacy. This 19th century painting of the resurrection, for example, represents the popular understanding of Jesus as theological justification for ideal humanity. Recall Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man as you look at the raised arms of the resurrected Christ. The artist Karl Bloch is not only giving his viewers an interpretation of Jesus post-resurrection, he's speaking the language of ideal humanity and theological anthropology that was vital to the formation of the Western world. Here's a side note. Scholars argue that aesthetic arts like this are more than something we behold at a distance. The aesthetic is formative. That is, it has a shaping effect on the viewers. It is engaging the space between the viewer and the canvas. Interacting with what we believe we know about the world we inhabit. Here, the white European idealized body is a deified body. The bodies that can be seen walking around in America and in Europe on any given day also serve to illustrate for us what Christ and the angels look like. Their ideal bodies illustrate the holy, the good, and beautiful. The reference to the masculine in this depiction of the holy is apparent by the placement of the angelic, pure, blonde, feminine angels who kneel in reverence before the one who is risen with all power here. This holy European man, this visualization works to highlight family values, the role of the patriarch, and the complementarian place of women. It is domestic virtue infused with religious piety. The women are depicted as modest, proportionate, sacred, and reverent, their positions forming a triangle with his sacred haloed head at the pinnacle. What are the implications for Christian life and social existence given to us by this understanding of Jesus? What does it communicate about God's will and work in the world? Just to highlight again, just to point to the fact that this perfect proportions of the human, rendered in a manner somewhat like the Vitruvian man, also with angelic, pure, feminine hosts kneeling before the one ascendant with all power. There is a politic at play as well in this depiction. Africans were forced into submission to this God-man, this white masculine sovereign, and depicted by Europeans as benefiting from the arrangement. This, for example, first time I showed this slide in a presentation at Duke Divinity School, friends and professors thought this was church. It looks like it could be a church meeting. In fact, it's a slave auction. This is an artist rendering of a slave auction. It's propaganda. The widely consumed understanding of the Negro served this developing understanding of white, moral, powerful, fully human, and sacred people. The slave was in good hands, safe from himself, well taken care of, and happy in submission to the white sovereign. Nothing wrong here. They're well dressed, doing well, happy even. This child is sleeping safely in mother's arms while the purchasers look on. And on the plantation, they have a blast. In 1933, Sterling Brown, Harlem Renaissance intellectual, described this rendering of the Negro as the contented slave. Out from under the care of the benevolent sovereign, the Negro reverts back to a natural, lazy, ugly, demonic, even demonic state. this scene from the birth of the nation, was actually, if you know much about that movie in particular, this was the modernization of the cinema. This film was shown at the White House. I believe Truman called it a wonderful film. It valorizes the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Here, this poor white woman is endangered by this Union black soldier, out from under the care of the benevolent white masculine sovereign. Your women need to be afraid, white women. They revert back to the natural demonic state, what Sterling Brown described as the brute Negro, or what is today commonly described as the super predator or thug. In 1924, the editors of the National Urban League's magazine, Opportunity, offered cash prizes to black intellectuals for innovative writing in the form of poems, short stories, and novels. The NAACP's Crisis magazine was soon to follow, and together these contests helped give rise to what at the time was known as the New Negro Movement, Young Negro Movement, New Negro Renaissance, the Harlem Renaissance. The writing contests birthed the Harlem Renaissance literary movement. Visual arts were soon to follow, with competitors earning cash awards from the Harmon Foundation. In general, the Harlem Renaissance saw a flourishing of arts in literature, music, sculpture, and paintings. But much more was at stake than art. Much more than art was at stake. Harlem had become the destination of choice for participants of the Great Migration, the nation's largest population shift, occurring about the time of World War I. This is one of the major waves. There's many different waves that happened up until the 70s. Forgetting the name of the author, The Warmth of Other Suns. Forgetting her. It's bugging her. That's going to bug me. It was a move from the farm field to the factory, from terrorism to the hope of safety. And it came to include a change of worldview and self-understanding as well. Harlem became symbolic as the birthplace of the new Negro, which was an ambiguous term. By the way, let me put a finger there and mention that when the NAACP was founded, the NAACP was founded by the fusing of two different groups, W.E.B. Du Bois's Niagara Movement, which was a gathering of black scholars after his published, he published Souls of Black Folk, which showed a rift, a different understanding of black life than what was present in the South at Tuskegee Institute with Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was a black leader, or at least he was perceived that way by the dominant public, by the dominant white public, who had advocated what many would argue, especially Du Bois, capitulation to segregation and white supremacy. He said, let down your bucket where you are at, meaning don't leave and go up north and so forth, but work. We need to accumulate wealth in the South. We need to accumulate finances and wealth, not paying attention to the fact that violence and death was a very real thing happening for black people, and the accumulation of wealth can't be done if you are lynched. So this is happening in the South with this capitulation, many would argue, and a different understanding of leadership. Leadership advocating not so much intellectual endeavors, education, and so forth, but the accumulation of wealth and working with your hands. Du Bois was an intellectual, first scholar to receive a PhD, black scholar from Harvard. Wanted to get his PhD, actually began to get his PhD in Berlin, but the finances dried up that was offering him that scholarship. So he came back and received his PhD at Harvard, argued for leadership from the front by example, which, by the way, I meant to mention, and forgive me this long foray, that I saw myself as capable of doing a PhD only because the board of your trustees at Sankofa, J. Alfred Smith, the only African-American professor I had in theological training told me that if I didn't get a PhD, it would be a mistake. He said, "You need to get a PhD. You've got a PhD mind." And so I took his advice. It was that kind of leadership, actually, that Du Bois was trying to do as well. And so he, in the North, and Booker T. Washington in the South, showed a different perspective on black life. And Mary White Ovington and a group of liberal whites gathered together, fused together with this Niagara Movement and formed the NAACP with white leadership. And it was housed in New York. That image of black and black leadership became associated with Harlem. And intellectuals and so forth gathered in Harlem around this, birthing this movement. A new Negro indicates that there is now an old one. What or who is the old Negro? And what does that mean? W.E.B. Du Bois was one of a number of mentors to the talented participants in the movement, and the leadership and participants differed to some extent as to what was meant by New Negro. Yet there were also many commonalities. In America, the New Negro was not African, but did have African ancestry and retained a link to African heritage. The New Negro was not Southern or folkish, but did retain some black Southern folk traditions, most notably related to religion. The New Negro could not be understood by reference to the historical white pejorative depictions of black people. In particular, the literary and visual treatment of black people in print and in art historically served to reinforce the ideology of white supremacy. It did so in every way, including theologically, socially, and politically. The Harlem Renaissance critically interrogated the normative claims made by white patriarchal sovereignty, including its claims to divinity, that constructed full humanity according to the ideal template of white men only. Put differently, Harlem Renaissance intellectuals and artists invite us to question what we think we know about humanity and into the possibility of social relations that do not include God-endorsed white supremacy. For instance, the poet Countee Cullen was one among many Harlem Renaissance intellectuals who depicted Christ as black, living in America under the conditions of white supremacy. When the German pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer spent time studying the Harlem Renaissance and attending a black Baptist church in Harlem, Cullen's poem, The Black Christ, is the only poem that Bonhoeffer mentions by name. The poem depicts a pious Christian mother who functions in a role a bit like Job, with her two sons becoming Job's accusers. The older son is the narrator of the poem, and he is initially depicted as being friendly towards the religion of his mother, gradually becoming more antagonistic and questioning of it. The relationship between the two boys represents somewhat of a relationship to Christianity between Southern and Northern black people around the time of the Harlem Renaissance, who would say to some degree in the North, if I had lived down there during that time, heck no, I would not have put up with it. And it was because of Christianity that my parents did. Some of that antagonism around religion. Finally, the younger son is lynched, as often happened in the parables and the depictions from the Harlem Renaissance. Lynched at home, in front of his house, actually, in front of his mother and his older brother, by an angry, racist mob. The Crisis magazine constantly, and New Amsterdam News constantly ran stories of lynchings that were happening in the South that never made it into the white public, newspapers. So this lynching happens, and the mother kneels to pray while her son is being lynched in Cullen's poem. And the son, seeing his mother kneeling to pray, while her son is being lynched by a white mob, finally loses it. Call on him now, I mocked, and try your faith against this deed, or his deed, while I, with intent equally as sane, searching a motive for this pain, will hold a little stone on high and ask of it a reason why. Which, stone or God, will first reply? What has he done for you who spent a bleeding life for his content? Or is white Christ too distraught by these dark skins his father wrought? No more of this Jesus stuff. You're on your knees praying to him while we're being lynched. What has he done for us? This white Jesus. There are Christians, obviously, who are doing the lynching. Orlando Patterson describes in Rituals of Blood the constant practice of white Christians lynching black bodies. Howard Thurman describes white Christians leaving service, church, lynching, coming back and finishing the sermon. Patterson even describes sometimes a hymn being sung before lynching. But in the morning in Cullen's poem, the younger brother comes back through the front door alive. Cullen's poem includes a resurrection. This is important for our purposes here, which I will get to eventually. He sees his brother come through the door again, and he says, and he has an epiphany, O form immaculately born, betrayed 1,000 times each morn, as many times each night, denied, surrendered, tortured, crucified. That is Jesus. Identifying with us, not with those in power, practicing domination and oppression, crucifying black bodies with religious zeal. Moral indignation, as they would use, as they would be so motivated to do. When Harlem Renaissance artists rendered Christ black, they were opening a new social reality, recalibrating humanity from the harmful ideals, and recovering black people from subhumanity in a society with a history of Christianity shaped in accordance with the self-aggrandizing notion of ideal humanity and ideal community. The Harlem Renaissance painter William H. Johnson is an example of one who did away with the conventional themes of modesty and proportionality with regards to representation of bodies on canvas, proportions, and images of the divine. I hate that is over that picture, but you can see it still clearly. This picture, this depiction of this painting is Jesus and the Three Marys. Not so much concerned with perfect proportions of human bodies. There is movement in this picture. There is different shaped bodies. And the women are haloed as well. Jesus and the Three Marys is evidence of the effort to recalibrate, the practice of recalibrating idealized notions to a healthier image, healthier reality. Art in the Harlem Renaissance was more than aesthetic. W.E.B. Du Bois claimed that all art is political. It's not beauty set apart from our daily lives as aesthetic trophies of social status. The aesthetic is drawing us into our daily social lives as an interaction with our understanding of reality. Art is social participation and moral experience. This is the meaning and the goal of the Harlem Renaissance. Scholars like Alain Locke, chair of the philosophy department at Howard University, was also a mentor to artists and intellectuals of the movement who supported depicting the new Negro with African heritage in a black Christian tradition to tell the story of black humanity in America. By associating black people with Christ and the resurrection, writers and artists are doing something different in Harlem than what was done with Jesus by many Europeans. Rather than an apologetic for authority and domination, a black connection to Christ becomes solidarity in suffering and condemnation of oppression. It is a connection with the resurrection that includes condemnation of oppression and abuse, condemning the religious folk who were complicit in the crucifixion of Christ as those who were complicit in the lynching of black people. I'm going to spend a little bit of time hovering around this artist, this last artist, Aaron Douglas. Aaron Douglas is the preeminent, oftentimes the most known visual artist of the Harlem Renaissance. I've got kids. When my kids were a little younger, my daughter in particular liked Princess and the Frog, the Disney movie. And if you've seen Princess and the Frog, go on ahead and just admit it. Yeah, I see you. Okay. Good movie. It's a good movie. The artwork for Tiana's restaurant at the beginning is all done in the style of Aaron Douglas. They did their homework. It's black. Aaron Douglas, like many of the artists, as I showed William H. Johnson, was creating something uniquely African American, uniquely black, by taking Egyptian tomb paintings, two-dimensional, not three-dimensional, two-dimensional, angular, and the West African Dan mask with its slit eyes, and crafting silhouettes. He used silhouettes, two-dimensional figures in the style of the Egyptian cave paintings, and the Dan mask for the faces with the slit eyes and so forth, to craft artwork that's uniquely African, uniquely black. It's a blending. Using concentric circles, here the Dan mask faces, and silhouetted two-dimensional figures. This is a soldier. Now, as you look at that painting, where is Jesus? The last few times I've showed this, what were you saying? I didn't mean to put you on the spot. The last 3 times I've showed this painting, people have picked it up right away. It's funny because I've shown this painting a lot. And it's typically the case that people would see this as Jesus. But you're right, that's Jesus. Yeah. This is Simon Cyrene. I grew up knowing this tradition, knowing this story. When Jesus could no longer carry the cross, the soldiers forced Simon to carry it. Simon of Cyrene, North Africa, black people. When Simon picked up the cross, people of African descent picked up the suffering of Christ. Co-suffering. Jesus is co-sufferer. Which makes, then, in the tradition, abusers, people who terrorize and abuse black people as complicit with the lynching of Christ, in the lynching of Christ. This was, Aaron Douglas did this for one of the collection of sermons in James Weldon Johnson's book, God's Trombones. And then they laid hold on Simon, black Simon, yes, black Simon. They put the cross on Simon, and Simon bore the cross. And given the history of interaction with Jesus and the connection to power and whiteness, there is something to say about Jesus being brought to the background and Simon being brought to the foreground. Not to minimize Jesus, so to speak, but to highlight his connection, or Simon's connection, with suffering, with Christ's suffering. To accentuate, as it were, a tradition of the way of Jesus. That is a connection with suffering. That is a condemnation of oppression. That is the advocacy for justice. Finally, I'll end our time together here with a suggestion and some questions for contemplation. As Sister Addie said, Sister Walker said, the practice of Sankofa, the history of Sankofa, explicitly includes looking back from our present location at the past, the ancestors. It's a practice, as we might say in the academy, of retrieval and analysis, which allows us to get inside of our practices and our ways of seeing the world we inhabit. We do this in order to look ahead, not simply staring back, but in order to look ahead to what we will do as faithful, informed, perhaps transformed people. The practice of retrieval and analysis is what informs our faithful lives. I'm arguing today that without careful retrieval and analysis of our understanding of what we know, or what we think we know, what we should know of our shared humanity, without retrieval and analysis for understanding of shared humanity in the West, our corresponding theology and the shape of our Christian ethics are malformed. Hence the question, what is a Negro, is asking us also, what is a white man or white woman? What is humanity? Who is my neighbor? Or even, what is good and what does the Lord require of me? Amen. That's what I got for you.